The Christmas Eve Ghost by Shirley Hughes. Once, in the old seaport city of Liverpool, when tramcars clanged up and down the main streets on iron tracks, there lived two children named Bronwyn and Dylan. They had not lived there very long. Mam had brought them there from their village in Wales after Da had died. Da had been killed in a mining accident when he was working deep underground. Bronwyn could just remember his strong arms and his smell of coal dust, but Dylan was too little to remember him at all. Mam earned a living for the three of them by doing other people's laundry. There were no washing machines in those days, and it was very hard work. She did not have enough money to pay someone to look after Bronwyn and Dylan, so early in the morning, before it was light, she had to leave them while they were still asleep. She pushed the big old pram uphill to the better part of the city, where the well-off people lived, to collect their dirty laundry. Mam hurried from house to house, delivering the clean washing and piling up the pram with dirty sheets and towels and shirts and pillowcases. Then she ran back as fast as she could, worrying and fretting all the way because she hated having to leave the children all alone in the house. But somehow she always managed to get back before they woke up, just in time to make their breakfast porridge. As soon as she had cleared the breakfast dishes, Mam set to work. At the back of the house was a narrow room with a stone floor called a wash house. In it were a sink, a wash tub, and a big iron mangle for wringing out the wet washing. In the corner was a little brick fireplace with an iron door, and above it was the metal basin with a wooden lid. This was called a copper. Bronwyn and Dylan watched as Mam lit the fire with sticks and newspaper and put bits of coal on top. Then she filled the basin with cold water from the sink and put the lid on. When the water was hot, Mam pushed the sheets and towels into the basin with soap flakes and began to boil them clean. Then she stood bent over her wash tub, rubbing and scrubbing at the smaller things with a bar of yellow soap while the wash house filled up with steam. When all the things were properly clean, she rinsed them in the sink. After that, she wrung them through the big iron mangle. Sometimes Bronwyn and Dylan helped to turn the big wheel, which worked the rollers that squeezed out the water. It made them feel very big and strong, turning and turning that wheel for Mam. You had to be careful not to pinch your fingers in the rollers as the laundry went through. The gray sudsy water drained into a big tub underneath. When that was done, Mam emptied the tub in the backyard. If the weather was fine, she carried all the laundry outside in big baskets and pegged it out on the clothesline to dry. But if it rained, she dried it in the kitchen, draped over wooden frames called clothes horses, or raised up to the ceiling on a pulley. On those days, Bronwyn and Dylan ate their dinner among the wet sheets. Next came the ironing. There was no electricity in their house, so Mam heated up her iron over the kitchen stove. She had to take great care not to make it too hot in case it scorched the linens. That would have been a great disaster. When it was all finished and aired, she folded it beautifully and piled it neatly in the old pram, ready to push it back up the hill early the next morning. Mam was a big, sturdy woman, but she did get very tired, and she hated the city dirt. In the evenings, she was mostly too tired to do anything but sit in her chair and look into the fire, remembering the green valley where she had lived as a child, and wishing that they were all back there again. Sometimes she told Bronwyn and Dylan thrilling stories about dragons and hauntings and wicked devils with tails and ghosties that came down the chimney at night. On fine days, Bronwyn and Dylan hopped and skipped and played some great games with the other children in the street. On Saturday nights, they had a bath in a tin tub in front of the kitchen fire. And on Sundays, they put on their best clothes and went in with Mam to sing hymns in chapel. In the house next to theirs lived Mr. and Mrs. O'Reilly and their 2 handsome sons. Mr. O'Reilly worked at the docks, unloading great bales of goods from the holds of ships that had come into the port from all over the world. The O'Reilly boys worked there too, alongside their dad. They set out very early in the morning with all the other men, tramping along the cobbled street. In the bad times, there was no work for them and no money either, and they had to stand idle on the street corner, whiling away the day as best they could. Ma'am never spoke to the O'Reillys except to say, "Good morning." "We keep ourselves to ourselves," she told Bronwyn and Dylan, and that meant that they were not to speak to the O'Reillys either. Bronwyn thought it was very strange. There was nothing wrong with the O'Reillys as far as she could see, but of course she did as Ma'am told her. The O'Reillys did not go to chapel. They went to another church. Once Bronwyn had peeked inside and seen beautiful statues and colored glass and candles all alight. She thought it looked lovely, much prettier than their plain chapel with its whitewashed walls. But when she asked Ma'am if they could go there one Sunday just for a change, Ma'am's face became very stern and serious. She told Bronwyn that the church was for a different sort of people, not their kind, and that she was never to look in there again. Christmas was coming, but times were bad, and there was no money to spare. Ma'am was working long hours to save a little extra to buy something nice for Bronwyn and Dylan. At last, on Christmas Eve, all the extra laundry was finished and folded into the pram. Bronwyn and Dylan went with Ma'am, delivering it to all the houses. On the way home, they saw the brightly lit shops with dead rabbits and turkeys and joints of meat hanging up and people selling toys in the street and piles of apples on market carts. Bronwyn and Dylan were tired because they had walked so far, so Ma'am took them home. But she still had more shopping to do. She did not like to leave the children alone in the house after dark, but this evening she picked up her purse and told them she was just going to run to the shop at the end of the street and that they were to play together like good children until she came back. "I won't be long," she said. "Don't answer the door if anyone knocks." After Ma'am had gone, Bronwyn put her dolls to bed and Dylan watched. She pretended that they were being naughty and not going to sleep until Father Christmas had visited. Dylan said, "I don't think Father Christmas will come to our house anyway, because if he came down our chimney, he'd burn his feet." "Perhaps he'll come through the back door," said Bronwyn. And then there came a knock. It was not the front door knocker. It came from the back of the house, and it was more like a plonk than a knock. Plonk it went, then plonk, plonk. They both sat still and listened. It came again. Plonk, 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 plonk. Bronwyn got up and crept into the back kitchen. Dylan followed, hanging onto her pinafore. The noise was coming from the wash house. It sounded strange and echoing. Bronwyn pushed open the door. There was only a little pale moonlight coming in from the window by the sink. "Maybe Father Christmas is coming down the wash house chimney," said Bronwyn. "Don't go in there, Bron. Please don't," whispered Dylan. The noise came again suddenly. It was certainly coming from the dark corner by the copper. Plonk, plonk, plonk. "Somebody's hiding in the copper," said Bronwyn. "And that somebody's trying to get out. It's not Father Christmas. It's a horrid ghostie coming down the chimney to get us," shrieked Dylan, and he bolted screaming through the kitchen, down the hallway, and out into the street. Bronwyn ran after him. She was screaming too. They did not run far. They fell straight into the arms of Mrs. O'Reilly, who was coming home with the family shopping. "Glory be! What in the world is all this then?" she cried, dumping down her baskets. After she had calmed Bronwyn and Dylan enough to hear their story, she left her shopping and took them each by the hand, and they all marched bravely back into the house. When Mrs. O'Reilly came with them to the dark wash house, it did not seem nearly so frightening. Soon the sound came from behind the copper again. Plonk, plonk, plonk. "Sure, I know what that noise is," said Mrs. O'Reilly firmly, "and it's nothing to be afraid of. You'd better come along back to my house until your ma gets back, and then you can see for yourselves." But first she said that Bronwyn must leave a note for Mam in case she was worried about where they were. So Bronwyn found a piece of paper and a stub of pencil and wrote, "Dear Mam, we are gone next door. Love and XXX, Bronwyn." They propped it up on the mantel beside the clock. Mrs. O'Reilly's house was very different from theirs. In the hallway was a picture of Mary and baby Jesus with a vase of flowers in front of it. And in the kitchen there were shelves with shining china and brass and a delicious smell of stew. At the back of the house was a wash house, just like theirs, but turned the other way around and brightly lit. In it were the two O'Reilly boys and their dad. They had rigged up a dartboard next to the copper and were in the middle of a game. When they threw a dart, it landed on the board. Plonk! "That's the noise you were hearing," Mrs. O'Reilly told Bronwyn and Dillon kindly. "Sure, and it's nothing but a game of darts. Nothing to be scared of now, is it?" Bronwyn and Dillon stared like two solemn little owls. The O'Reilly boys stopped their game and grinned at them. Mam was very flustered and anxious when she came to fetch them, but she found Bronwyn and Dillon sitting happily by the O'Reillys' kitchen fire, eating slices of bread dripping with golden syrup. "I'm very grateful to you," said Mam to Mrs. O'Reilly when she heard all about what had happened. "I blame myself for leaving the children alone, but it's so difficult sometimes." "Think nothing of it, Mrs. Williams," said Mrs. O'Reilly. "I'll be glad to keep an eye on them any time you need to slip out." Then Mam and Mrs. O'Reilly drank a cup of tea together and chatted. When it was time to say good night, they all wished one another a happy Christmas. That night, when Bronwyn and Dillon had hung up their stockings and were safely tucked up in bed, Mam told them to remember Da in their prayers and give thanks for all blessings that Christmas night. "Can I give thanks for Mrs. O'Reilly and Mr. O'Reilly and the O'Reilly boys too?" asked Dillon. "Mrs. O'Reilly was a big blessing to us when we thought there was a horrid ghostie in the wash house," added Bronwyn. Mam did not answer for a moment. Her face was very serious and thoughtful. But then she smiled, and it was like the sun coming out over green fields. "Yes, of course you must," she said. The end. A note from Shirley Hughes. I always knew that one day I would make a picture book that drew on my vivid childhood memories of Liverpool in the 1930s. The bustling shops, tramcars, and thrilling monumental buildings stood in stark contrast with the cramped squalor of the back streets, where the struggle to keep clean and make a decent life for a family was very hard. I found all the domestic details easy to recall. The huge challenge of Monday morning wash day, with the washing all done by hand, the wash tubs, scrubbing boards, mangles, and clotheslines, which I well remember, are now, for most people, mercifully a thing of the past. But the kindness of neighbors like Mrs. O'Reilly, who comes to the rescue when Bronwyn and Dillon are sure that a ghost is stalking their wash house, is something we all need and depend upon today as much as ever. Shirley Hughes.